Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. I'm very excited to welcome author David Grann and screenwriter Eric Roth to the stage to discuss Killers of the Flower Moon. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to go back to the beginning, David, and I don't know that it would be accurate to call this a secret history or a hidden history, but it certainly is not a key part of the American historical memory before you write your book. So I'm wondering, how did you come upon the story and decide that it needed the sort of in-depth treatment that you give it?
Sure. A historian I was speaking to had mentioned the case to me, didn't know much about it. And so I had made a trip. I decided to make a trip out to the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. And at that point, I wasn't planning on writing a book. I thought maybe there'd be an article or whatnot. And the first thing I did was I visited the Osage Nation's museum. And when I was there, and I described this in the book, there was this great panoramic photograph on the wall. It was taken in 1923 or 1924, and it looked very innocent when I was staring at it. But I noticed it showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers, and I noticed that a portion of the photograph was missing. And I asked the then museum director, Catherine Redcorn, who I was meeting for the first time then, why was part of the photograph missing? And she had said it had contained this figure so frightening, she had decided to remove it. And then she pointed to the missing panel. I'll never forget this. As she said, the devil was standing right there. And she went down into the basement and she pulled up an image of the missing panel. And there, peering out very creepily from the corner, was William K. Hale with a chapeau and little glasses. And I was very haunted by that because I kept thinking, okay, Catherine and the other people, Osage at the museum, had removed the photograph not to forget what had happened, but because they couldn't forget. And yet here there were so many people, and I include myself foremost among them, who had never learned this history. We had not been taught it. We had effectively excised it from our conscience. And so it was very rare that a book has an origin story, but that was the origin story. And in that moment, I knew if I could, it was a story I wanted to tell.
Eric, for you, what was your first exposure to the book? And especially given what we, have learned since about the reworking of the screenplay, what sort of struck you in your gut at first as cinematic about the story?
Well, I also felt like David, I knew nothing about this, like the Tulsa Massacre. It was like, where was I? I'm a fairly educated guy and everything, and I felt like, how could this even exist without me knowing anything about it? And it came to me through a pretty traditional Hollywood way that on books they think are kind of important, they team up people that they'd like to potentially do it. And David's agent named Matthew Snyder sent it to me. I don't know if he sent a book or galleys, maybe.
I think it was just probably paper.
Paper, yeah, paper.
I don't think it was a book yet.
And they sent it, but it went out to like, I don't know, 8, you would know better than me almost, David. 10 teams, in quote, each of the studios at that time. And it was very nice. I was linked with Leonardo for Paramount. And a guy who ran it then, Brad Gray, he really loved the book. And I went crazy for it, in other words. So it was like, I think I read it in 3 hours or something. And it was like, I said to David just a few minutes ago, I think I've made like 30 movies. And the reason I'm saying that, because most are adaptations. None are even close to the workmanship of this and and the sophistication and the ideas. And so this is by far the best book I ever received, I think.
Thank you.
I'll do one hesitation. So, because I was asked to do Cuckoo's Nest, and
I'll take that. That's fine.
So I'm going to say that might be equal, but my agent said to me they'll never make it, and I ended up doing rewriting on it. So I got to be part of that. But I guess that was the only other thing I can think of that was even close to the sophistication and everything. So they had an auction. Paramount went to, I think, like $2.5 million, which was a large number. And I remember driving somewhere and I was talking to an agent. I said it'd be interesting if a billionaire came into it, because it's chump change to them, and made an offer that was just close things down, and also would then have a piece of material that was just not a vanity thing, which is a lot of times billionaires do that. And sure enough, a man named Dan Friedkin came in, and they bought the book. I was not involved in the sale at all. It was good for David, I think. Now they opened it up as a job, and I went in and I guess you call it, applied like anybody else, and told them my take on it, and they said yes. And so I was the luckiest man on earth, I thought. Leonardo was not involved anymore at that point, and I just got to call David up and say, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
And Marty.
And let me just return the compliment, not to make this a love fest, but for me, it was such you're so nervous when you have a work that is a piece of history that is also about one of the more monstrous crimes and racial injustices in American history. How is it going to be adapted? Is it going to be judicious? Is it going to respect the history? There's a different kind of standard and threshold you have when you sell that kind of material. And the moment I talked to Eric, his level of curiosity, his commitment to the history, the level of questions, the detail, also just knowing all his past work, there was just such a level of comfort on my part. I knew he was going to do something that would be his own, as it should be, but that would get at these deeper truths. So it was a privilege, and I think you just witnessed the results, I think.
Which was also, a broader collaboration. Literally the first day I walked in to work with Marty, who I've known for a number of years, we tried a few projects that never worked out, but I said, let's do this together, and he said, how great, and he's not a guy who sits at a typewriter particularly, but, and it's a longer conversation, but I'm only including it because I feel this way about David, that it's all a collaboration of a kind, and hopefully it works out to be the best collaboration. And David was always available to me, and I had a number of questions, and he could answer like 98% of them. So that was how it began, and then I took you. Oh, you're right. Somebody told me I keep doing that. Okay, I got to do this. Thank you. We'll talk later. So I took about a year to write a first draft, and it was quite long. And then they gave me some notes, the company that bought it, which is called Imperative, and most were fair enough, I thought. And then I don't remember, and David, maybe you do better than I do. Still doing it? Oh, okay. I feel like a puppet. So I don't remember if it first went to Leonardo or first went to Marty. And you know
I
better?
don't know.
You don't know.
No,
I don't know either.
no.
So whoever came on was enough to make it real, and then Marty and I started to work almost immediately, but this has been over a course of 7 years, is it, David?
Yeah, it's been a long
7,
time,
8
yeah.
years, yeah. And Marty made a movie in between, The Irishman, and we had the pandemic, and so it's not an unusual history. I've had a couple of movies that have taken, I did one with Bob De Niro called The Good Shepherd, took 14 years. Things like that. So you have to kind of hang around and move on with some other things. But this thing, I think, always felt to me like it was meant to be, because I think it was just such an important story. And we're lucky about David Graham being here. True.
I think one of the most reported aspects of the film's rollout so far has been the changes made midstream. So Leonardo DiCaprio DiCaprio was originally planning to play Tom White, who ended up being played by Jesse Plemons. And, you know, including in the production notes to the film, there's a discussion of, you know, Leo saying, we need to make changes. He quotes David saying, we need to center the Osage perspective. I have two of the masterminds here on stage with me. Take me through sort of like when in the process, who initiated it, how many times did you cry when you had to rewrite this from, you know, how did that come about and end up with something similar to what we ended up seeing on screen today?
Well, I could answer from my point of view. David kept emphasizing we need to really lean into the Osage. Have to lean into the Osage point of view, and that was always, I think, forefront in most of what we were doing. But at some point, this was, you know, maybe 3 or 4 years into having written it originally as kind of a grand Western is what we had thought about it, as a John Ford Western of a kind, which was, and it also embraced this Tom White character was the lead character as it was in the book, kind of an interesting man who seemed almost, I read everything known to man about him and I couldn't find really any real flaws about him. And so I added a few, but he was just he was a Texas Ranger and a real kind of American hero that way. And then went into the FBI because he couldn't get into World War I where he wanted to go fight. And he had, I think, hernia condition or something. Is that right, David? Hernia. But so that's what we that was the script we wrote. You know, that was it was bigger and broader, almost as a big Western. The one thing we did do, I was just telling this to David too. Marty and I both decided we were going to let the audience in on what was going on. In other words, who was doing it. And so that there wasn't a mystery. The only person who didn't know would be the Tom White character and the FBI. But it was about this man coming into town and, you know, and what his life was like. But it was a grand horse opera in its own way. And then one night, we did a reading of it, which was like a 4-hour reading. And I think that something about it made Leonardo uncomfortable, and I know what it was later, but I was in New York, and as I say, this is 3 or 4 years later, and we were kind of gearing up to make the movie as it was written, pretty much, and Marty called me like late at night and said, are you sitting down? I said, I'm actually laying down, I'm in bed, and he said, well, Leonardo has a big idea. So when you hear a movie star's got a big idea, that could be a problem. Anyhow, so we went and met the next day, but as I was riding over, I could figure out what he wanted to do, and he decided I don't want to play the hero for a couple reasons. I'm not sure he feels he might be Gary Cooper in that sense. I don't know. You'd have to ask Leonardo, but more so, he felt that we were going down a road of sort of the Great White Hope. A white guy's going to save these poor natives, you know, and I don't think he was particularly wrong, you know. In other words, I think it was a valid perspective, and we sat and said, what are we going to do now, right? And I started from scratch to a certain extent. I mean, I did another, 10 drafts, let's say, with him now as Ernest Burkhart character, which he wanted to play. Had to invent kind of a background for him to some extent, and then tell a story from that point of view. And then the structure, I don't think is really, I'd have to think, but I don't think it's changed much from what that version was, except for Marty kept leaning into two things. One was the Osage traditions and their point of view, which was 100% right. And then the sort of interesting nature of the relationship between Ernest and William Hale. And it became the movie you see. I mean, a couple things, and then I'll shut up, that Marty felt right away that he wanted the audience, this was even with the other versions, to feel culpable. That everybody should feel like, what have we been part of here? That, you know, and so anytime we would look out a window, for instance, I want people to feel like there's something not right. And he then, he has, I think, one of the real bravura pieces of cinema with the fire. And that sort of says that all. That's the metaphor for it. But it was even just looking at, and I think David told me this, that there was only like at one point 2,500 Osage, let's say, right?
On the tribal roll,
Yeah.
yes.
And then all of a sudden 15,000, like Caucasians rolled in here. And so it was that kind of thing we had on an early commercial, like, can you find the wolf, And so the only thing I'll add is that, as I say, this collaborative nature of screenwriting particularly, it's just a bastardized art form. I don't think it's a great art. It's a great craft. You can be artful at it. But it is a director's medium, period. And you really have to be able to make sure the director's happy to fulfill his vision. And so that's what my job is. And hopefully add to it, And anyway, I guess, does that answer everything? Too much?
No, that was great.
Okay.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that, I think sometimes authors, when they're seeing their material adapted, they want some kind of exact replication. And that can't happen. They're extremely different mediums. I work in the rigor of history and pure facticity, and my decisions are shaped by the underlying materials. There are places I cannot go and I will never go as a historian that a screenwriter and a filmmaker can do. And my book was structured from 3 competing points of view. The first perspective was all Molly's and what was happening to her and the Osage history and her family. And I thought it was very important to anchor the book in the Osage perspective. And so the first third of the book is Molly's story. The second third of the book is told from the point of view of the FBI. And then the third chronicle is told from the present, and it's told from the point of view of descendants, including Molly's family. And it tries to show that there really was a much deeper and darker conspiracy that the FBI never exposed, and that these killings went way beyond William K. Hale. And that this really was a culture of killing. And I think you get this glimpse it in the movie with that scene at the end. I think they were trying to get at this. I remember in conversations, when Ernest gets out of, when he goes to meet with the lawyers, Brendan Fraser, and that scene, and you suddenly see the whole community, right? That was that idea. But the book really tries to document how the morticians were involved, how the doctors, as you saw, were administering poison, as bankers and lawmen were involved, and how many others were complicit in their silence, and that the real death toll was way beyond the official death toll of 24. And many of these had nothing to do with Hale. Many other people were complicit in these crimes. So it's a sweeping work of history, and that would never work as a film. And I don't expect it to work. And so I thought the way they did it was actually quite brilliant. I never got to see the original, the first draft, but what I did see, I think, works really well, because what you're able to do in a film is to inhabit characters and to narrow the lens. And you can use the relationship of Early and Molly to tell the larger story, which is very representational of what was happening. A historian, you are always an external observer. As a filmmaker and as a screenwriter, you are actually inhabiting these people and showing their consciousness, which is something I can't do. And so I don't expect them to be the same. The thing that I always care about is, do you get at those truths in your own different mediums and meet there at the end? And I feel very proud of the fact that they did such a wonderful job in doing that.
I didn't have to do this with David because the material was so rich, but I've always warned every author, at the end of the day, you may not like me. Because because I'm going to have to dramatize things. I'm going to have to create things to make it more concise. I mean, even this at 3.5 hours, I forget, maybe it's David Fincher who said, you can't do someone's biography, you have in 2 hours, but you can show what the sense of a human being is, or, what motivated them and all. Otherwise, you're going to do something that's a documentary or something that lasts for 14 hours, and you're probably not even going to get there then.
It's interesting hearing the two of you talk about kind of the different media, because one of the things that strikes me watching it is Ernest is a really fascinating character. He says up front and very loudly that he loves women, whiskey, and money. And yet by the end of the film, we see him seem genuinely concerned when he hears that Molly's in the hospital, even after he's been poisoning her for months. So I'm wondering, one, David, if you could tell us a little bit about what we know about Ernest from the historical record in terms of his motivations or his personality, et cetera. And then, Eric, if you could talk about sort of running with this idea of Ernest as a pretty simple guy or as a cipher, because I think it's a really fascinating interplay.
Yeah. What we know in terms of Ernest's inner thoughts are limited to kind of testimony. You get to know him in part through Molly's eyes. Molly always kind of detected beneath his roughness, which is he liked to play poker. He was often hanging out at the pool hall, as we see in the film. She had detected what she thought was a certain sensitivity about him. And you do get a sense from the records and from interviews, oral histories about the family, including with interviews I did with Molly's granddaughter, Margie, who's still alive, and what she had heard from her parents, that there was genuine affection between them, that there was beneath this kind of murderous scheme some element of a relationship that obviously she was unaware of what was going on. I think that and then I'll let Eric take over, but I think what makes Ernest important to the story, I remember when Leo actually called, Mr. DiCaprio, I should say, called me up and said, I'm thinking now of playing Ernest. What do you think? And I said, well, I would if I were you. I think in some ways Ernest is one of the more interesting figures, even though we have limited knowledge. Why is he interesting? Because unlike Hale, who is in some ways sociopathic, Ernest is the person who has a conscience and yet goes along with these crimes. And when there are systematic crimes like this, it's people like Ernest we have to understand. It's much easier to understand a crime if there's this kind of singular evil figure that you then remove from society and makes that person different than us. But what if ordinary citizens, including somebody like Ernest, despite his affections, despite his knowledge, keeps going along with these crimes? Being of the Jewish tradition, we always refer to them as the willing executioners. And if you're going to understand these kind of crimes, you have to understand the willing executioners.
Well, one of the things that initially we were concerned about was Marty and I and Leonardo, and particularly Marty and I, said, where in literature or movies or art or something is somebody in love with somebody and trying to kill them? And you can find very few examples, and maybe you could think of some I haven't thought of, but we came up with like 3 or maybe 2, but Desdemona in Othello, Talented Mr. Ripley, which we think was a love story of a kind, and a little bit of Place in the Sun, but not quite. It's not really quite that, but so that was it. So, I mean, that's why I think his performance on top of everything else he did, I think it's an amazing performance. I think he showed not only being tender with her and loving her, but also obviously was trying to kill her. Part of what interested me, which was from David, obviously, and from facts, was that when he had cancer and was dying, he wanted his ashes spread by his son Cowboy over the Osage hills, and I think that showed some attachment to something, that was important to him. But we made him. I just said to David that I think I remember writing that he was kind of slow, as a analytical guy, and was very susceptible to his uncle's Svengali qualities. And then as I say, then he ran into, I think, as I say, this love story between the two of them. I'm just laughing, I'm sorry. Anyhow, I think we embraced that, and then we said, so if we're looking at it, it's still about Molly, the whole movie, as far as I'm concerned, and the Osage, but if we're going to look at it through this guy's eyes, what does he have to say? What are the things that motivate him? And that's what you see. I mean, as best we could do that, you know. But it was very complicated. It's hard to do. Otherwise, you could do a lot of sort of mustache twirling, you know, and evil people conspiring.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask. The movie has sort of inspired a debate, a conversation about movie running times and intermissions. So I would be curious if, you know, someone came to you with hesitation and said, I don't know if I can go to a 3.5-hour movie. What do you say to them?
Well, I think this is worth seeing. To me, it's like a great book, but that's my point of view. I always say, and as I said, I've written many, many movies, that the movies are as long as short as the director wants them to be. And so and Marty felt this story was worth telling, and telling at some length. And we could debate whether there's some things that should come out or not, but this is his movie, and this is his statement. You know, I think once we talked about an intermission, he immediately kind of dismissed it. But I mean, I'm all in favor of the artist being able to, you know, sort of say what he has to say, and he felt it needed telling. And Marty has a funny point of view that, well, people spend 5 hours watching football games or something. I said, well, I don't know about 5 hours. Anyhow, but I think that's just the case. I mean, in other words, now you know, it depends on the director, obviously. Marty commands about anything he wants, you know, from money to time and everything else. A younger director or something might not have that opportunity.
I would just say, I mean, this is really a question in terms of Eric, but I'll just say as a consumer now, because I'm not I don't make movies. So you know, it reminds me, I'll use an analogy from my own profession, which is being a magazine writer for many years. And nothing would drive me crazier when they would say, your story has to fit a hole. It's got to be, the slot is, it's got to be 3,000 words. So I said, well, what if the story needs 15, like, to tell it? So to me, a story is as long as it should be. And so I hate debates when they're about length as an abstraction. Does anyone say Tolstoy, War and Peace is too long? You know, it's execution dependent. So I can't answer your question about this movie. I know my own personal feeling about it. I think it's worthy of the length time. But I think these artificial decisions about what the length should be is an abstraction. It's just like some movies feel too long and some feel too short. And so it's whether it's worthy, and judge it as a work of art, and then critique it when you watch it. If you say it feels too long, that's fine. But this idea of what should be a length, you know, get some popcorn.
Good for you.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us. This was a really wonderful conversation, and I have so many more questions about the movie, but I will save all of you so that you can go claim your books. Thank you again for coming out. We appreciate it.
Thank you all.